This is a painting that I find absolutely captivating. It glows with an incredible golden light. I feel as if I can almost reach out and touch the musician angels. And I love the way that the Christ child has his chubby little fingers jammed in his mouth. He looks just like a real toddler.
I'm not the only person who's thought this. Vasari, who in the 16th century wrote what amounted to one of the earliest histories of art, was of the same view. Masaccio, he wrote, can be given credit for originating a new style of painting. He produced work that is living, realistic and natural.
Of course, it's not as lifelike as watching a film or looking at a photograph. The Virgin Mary seems a bit distant, and I'm not sure that I find the Christ child's body entirely convincing. But these figures look much more like real people than those in many earlier Italian paintings. They have rounded flesh and realistic hair and fingernails. The space they're sitting in also looks three-dimensional.
This is the sort of development that's a key part of the Renaissance, this time of new ideas that's been seen as a rebirth of art and culture. Renaissance is a French word that literally means rebirth.
It's a period when Western European art changed radically. In a relatively short space of time, starting in the late 13th century, highly patterned, stylised images gave way to much more naturalistic ones. For the first time in centuries, artists actively sought to observe the world around them and try to reflect what they could see in the paintings and sculpture they made. The change in the way art looked was dramatic.
But why did it happen at this particular point in history? Why did some of the key developments happen in what is now northern Italy? And how did the artists know what to do?
The National Gallery's unique collection of early Italian Renaissance paintings is a great place to start exploring these questions. Of course, there isn't one straightforward story to be told. Art history is rarely a progression in a straight line from A to B, from unrealistic to realistic art.
What actually happens is nowhere near as neat as that, and as a result is much more interesting.
At the National Gallery, we pick up the trail in the late 13th century in Tuscany and Umbria. Entering the first rooms of the Sainsbury wing, you find yourself in a very particular world, filled with saints and angels, often with quite similar faces, and lots of gold and patterned surfaces. This is the oldest painting in the National Gallery's collection, Margherito of Arezzo's Virgin and Child enthroned with saints, which was made in the 1260s. It was probably an altarpiece. Nearly all of the surviving paintings from this period are religious. It might have stood behind the altar table, like the painted panels in this picture by Sasetta. The Virgin Mary and Christ Child dominate the centre of this panel, much bigger than the other figures since they are the most important. On either side are smaller squares filled with action-packed scenes from the lives of saints. This one shows St. John the Evangelist being freed by an angel from a cauldron of boiling oil, rescued at the last minute. Here we've got St. Nicholas saving 3 youths from execution. My favourite is this one. It shows St. Margaret being swallowed alive by a dragon while she was in prison. You can see the bars represented by this grid of lines over the picture. The story went that the power of her prayer was enough to force open the dragon's belly, so in the same picture we also see her tumbling out onto the floor unharmed. This miraculous escape made St. Margaret the patron saint of women in childbirth. This painting has a very distinctive look to it. The figures are flat and bounded by thick dark outlines. The faces look similar to each other. They're a bit like masks. The spaces inhabited by these figures are not very realistic. They don't look three-dimensional, and there aren't any shadows. When Margherito's painting was bought by the National Gallery in the 19th century, it was as an example of bad, rather crudely painted art. The director of the gallery at the time thought that having this as the starting point of the collection would allow the rest of the gallery to show how much Italian art progressed after the 13th century. But the flatness, outlines and mask-like faces weren't the result of a lack of skill at all. Those features are actually about the strong influence of art from the Eastern Christian Church, Byzantine art. Small icons, rather like this one in the British Museum, had come to Italy over many generations, sometimes with their makers too. This was the result of close trading links, particularly between Venice and the East. Their lack of realism is very deliberate. It's what makes them powerfully symbolic to the people who still use this kind of icon in prayer. The Virgin Mary is always supposed to look like this, an unchanging, wonderful being who is of a completely different substance to you and me. This way of painting religious figures was very influential in Italian art for a long time. You can see how this painting by an anonymous Umbrian master shares similar features with the icon. The same is true too of Margarito's painting. What we see here is deliberately unrealistic. It's meant to look like another world, a shimmering golden heaven where there are no shadows, because these holy figures do not sit under the same light as us.
The fact that there's quite a strong symbolic reason for having art that doesn't look that realistic means it's all the more interesting that painting does then change. Why does it happen? Art starts to change in the 13th and 14th centuries in Italy because society starts to change. Take Florence, where I am now. This is a city that becomes enormously wealthy at this time. It has a very profitable textile trade and it's one of the big European banking centres. Florentine bankers actually invented cheques, credit, life insurance, double-entry bookkeeping and Europe's first single currency, the gold florin. Well, it may sound boring, but it made them an awful lot of money. Then, as now, excess money tended to be spent on display, and this could often mean things like cultural patronage, art and architecture. Partly this was for reasons of civic pride. Rival cities like Florence and Siena vied to outdo each other in the churches that they built and the art that they made to go in them. But it also had a lot to do with religion. These were people who absolutely believed that their continued health and prosperity depended on the support of Jesus, Mary and the other saints. Commissioning expensive custom-made art was a way of showing them, as well as your peers, that you were an extremely devoted person. This might explain why lots of art is being made at this time, but it doesn't really explain why it starts to look different. That has a lot to do with changing religious and philosophical ideas at this time.
The 13th century was a time of questioning, change and reform. Universities were founded, which meant that not all scholars were part of the controlled world of the monastery. They started to debate Christian doctrine and talked about the very different ideas about the world expressed in Aristotle's ancient writings on the natural sciences and philosophy. These had recently been reintroduced to the West via Arab scholars in Spain. One result of this was that scholars and artists started to be interested in classical art, particularly the very realistic-looking sculptures that had survived from ancient cultures. Another result was reform in the church, and that had a big impact on the way that art came to look.
The call for reform within the church led to the rise of new orders of monks who lived frugally and worked with the poor. The two most important orders were the Franciscans and Dominicans, the followers of St. Francis and St. Dominic respectively. These orders put a great emphasis on teaching and built new churches within which to do it. This is the church of Santa Maria Novella. It's the Florentine base of the Dominican order. As you can see, it's huge. This was partly so that they could fit in lots of people to do their preaching, but also so that they could keep up with the Franciscans who were busy building the church of Santa Croce across the other side of the city at the same time in the early 14th century. The Franciscans and Dominicans believed that art could really help them to teach the central messages of Christianity. They called for more personal devotion, prayer, and encouraged people to study and contemplate the lives of Jesus and the saints. They filled their churches with paintings, particularly wall paintings, frescoes, which told the stories of these exemplary men and women. Altarpieces made out of painted wooden panels could also tell these stories, and they were a focal point for prayer. This is the sort of thing that's often ended up in museums like the National Gallery. They were sometimes dismantled later on to make way for new art.
These panels all show scenes from the life of St. Francis. They were painted in the mid-15th century by a Sienese artist known as Sassetta. They're all from an altarpiece made for the church of San Francesco in Borgo San Sepolcro, another Tuscan town. There used to be a big painting of St. Francis in the centre, and then all of these panels were arranged on either side. The pictures trace St. Francis's life, including good deeds like donating his cloak to a poor knight. In the same panel, he's also shown asleep, dreaming of the order of monks that he would set up. Here, he's giving up all of his wealth, taking off his rich clothes and turning away from his earthly father so that he can devote himself to God's work. In this panel, he's saving the town of Govier from a vicious wolf. And here, he's receiving the stigmata. Legend told that St. Francis had a vision of a fiery angel, and wounds appeared on him in the same places as Christ's hands and feet were nailed. It's a sign of his faith and his holiness.
You can get quite engrossed in St. Francis's life through these paintings. I think this is partly because of the amount of detail in each panel. People did actually know quite a lot about the life of this particular saint because he'd lived relatively recently, in the 13th century. You could get information about other saints' lives from new books like The Golden Legend. This was an action-packed compendium of details about different saints and what they'd done. But I think the thing that really engages me in what this man supposedly did, how he prayed and helped others, is the relatively realistic way in which each scene has been painted.
Naturalism, painting something so that it looks like a realistic illusion of the world around us, so that it looks like nature, had a great deal to offer monks and the people they encouraged to commission art. Look at these two works. This is the late 13th century diptych or two-panelled work by an unknown Umbrian artist that we saw earlier. It shows the Virgin and Child and the Man of Sorrows, Christ full of pain, suffering to save mankind. This is a diptych showing similar subject matter made in Northern Europe about 200 years later by the workshop of Dirk Bouts. Which one do you think you'd find easier to relate to empathise with? Might you respond more immediately to one rather than the other? Would it be the more realistic one? Not everyone will have the same response, and in a way it's not a question that we can easily apply to a 13th century audience, since they were so used to looking at and praying in front of paintings like the Umbrian Master Diptych. These less realistic paintings could also communicate pain and emotion in ways that I still find quite effective. Line can do that. Look at the agonised shape of the neck and shoulders of this figure of Christ.
In this late 13th century painted crucifix, the figures of Christ and those mourning him are painted in a very simple way that's still very closely related to Byzantine art. But the very shape of each simple stylised body communicates emotion for me to contemplate.
This is the Virgin Mary in blue, swooning at the sight of her crucified son, and supported by Mary Magdalene in red.
These two women aren't painted realistically at all, but the very shape of their bodies provides me with an emotional connection to the painting.
So, naturalism is by no means the only way to engage viewers in art that's intended to be part of prayer and Christian teaching, as the Franciscans and Dominicans urged. But, and it's a big but, it is an effective strategy for getting and keeping the viewer's attention. And it works particularly well with the little details, the sort of material written about more and more in devotional texts designed to help people to pray. This tiny panel was painted by another late 13th century artist, Cimabue. You can see elements of both the older, more stylised approach to painting, as well as clear attempts to paint more realistically. The faces still have that feel of the Byzantine mask about them. But Cimabue has tried to paint the throne as if it's a three-dimensional object. Some of the drapery has been made to look like real folds of cloth. There's even the illusion of transparency in parts. I think the areas where you see the real advantages of naturalistic painting are in the way that Cimabue has represented the relationship between the Virgin Mary and Christ. Look at how he holds on to her huge hand with his tiny fingers. There's also this lovely, caring gesture of the angel who holds the cushion as if to make sure that he doesn't slide off. Art in Italy became more and more about painting the stories of the central figures in Christianity, the stories of their relationships and actions, in ways that people could understand and to which they could perhaps relate. Increasingly, artists tried to paint realistic-looking settings and to put recognisable emotional reactions on the faces of figures in their paintings. This panel was painted by the workshop of Giotto, who was seen as a real pioneer in this area. It was part of an early 14th century altarpiece and shows the Pentecost. The 12 apostles who would spread the Christian message had gathered together after Christ's ascension to heaven. Suddenly, tongues of heavenly fire appeared on their heads. They were filled with the Holy Spirit. You can see this symbolised by the white dove flying in the air, golden lines radiating downwards. Men from all over the world were amazed to find that they could hear everything the apostles said in their own language. We see the apostles reacting in different ways to this miraculous event. One even looks a little alarmed. Others raise their faces in wonder towards the Holy Spirit, and some start to converse, to communicate, starting their mission already. The most astonished reactions are to be found in the figures outside the special enclosure of the apostles. These men can hardly believe their ears.
Giotto was one of the early Renaissance artists who really pushed the boundaries of visual representation in his time. The ideas that he and his workshop developed were very quickly spread around Italy. He travelled to make art for churches in cities like Florence, Padua and Milan, and even went as far south as Rome and Naples.
Much of his art was fresco wall painting, easily visible to other artists in search of new ideas and new business. The National Gallery also has some panels by another artist who played a major role in developing a more naturalistic way of painting, Duccio di Boninsegna. During the late 13th and early 14th centuries, Duccio dominated painting in Siena, the city that sought to rival Florence in terms of power and display. These three panels are from the predella of Duccio's most famous work, the Maestà. It means majesty in Italian and refers to the fact that this huge altarpiece shows the Virgin and Child enthroned majestically in the centre. The predella panels ran underneath the main image at the front, telling different stories from the life of Christ. The first of the National Gallery paintings was the first panel you encountered as you read left to right along the sequence of little scenes. It shows the Annunciation. The angel Gabriel appears in Mary's rather beautiful courtyard, a space decorated by a single pot of white lilies which symbolise the Virgin's purity. He tells Mary that she is going to bear the Son of God. She's holding a book open at a page where the prophet Isaiah describes this very event. Mary has been reading this, and suddenly the Word has been made flesh. She makes a self-effacing gesture and seems almost to back into the open doorway to her three-dimensional house. The other two National Gallery panels were originally located next to each other in the predella that ran along the back of the altarpiece. There were images on both sides of this huge painted construction, some of which were only usually seen by the priests. The first panel shows Jesus opening the eyes of a man born blind, watched by a crowd of disciples and other onlookers. The action takes place in what looks like a typical Tuscan city, carefully constructed by an artist who is trying hard to use lines to create a sense of three-dimensional space. The background was probably done by a specialist architecture painter attached to Duccio's studio. The story is enacted in the foreground. The Gospel of St. John told how Jesus smeared a mixture of mud and spittle on a blind man's eyes. When he washed them, his sight was miraculously restored. Duccio shows the two moments side by side. There's the same figure, in the same clothes, exclaiming in wonder when he realises that he can see. There were several variations at the initial underdrawing stage. Originally, this man was shown bent over, washing his eyes in the fountain beside him. The decision to change his position might have been a rather innovative way to keep the story and the eye moving on. When you look from this panel to the painting that came next, you see that they actually work together. Duccio has designed them so that it looks as if with his new sight the man is able to marvel at the awesome vision of the transfiguration of Christ when Jesus appeared in radiant glory to 3 of his disciples.
It's another new way of telling stories through paintings, animating the characters so that they appear to move through a life that's unfolding before our eyes. It's interesting that Duccio makes innovations like this in the predella panels rather than in the main part of the altarpiece. It was perhaps easier to be innovative and experimental in the more marginal parts of the project. Duccio's Maestà was made for this building, Siena's cathedral, known as the Duomo. It took him nearly 4 years to complete, and when it was done in 1311, the whole town came to a halt to take part in a grand procession. The painting was paraded first of all around the Campo, the town square, and then brought here for a special mass. It was clearly a painting that had a deep religious significance for the town and also for the artist. Duccio wrote on the central panel, "Mother of God, be thou a source of peace for Siena and of life to Duccio, because he painted thee thus." So it is almost like the act of painting itself is an act of devotion to the Virgin Mary. At the same time, though, this painting was very much part of a business transaction. We think that it was the most expensive painting to have been commissioned at the time. Duccio had to do certain things, though, in exchange for this.
Duccio had to promise to work only on this commission and not to accept any other jobs until it was finished. He was also supposed to do all of the work himself, although we know that in fact he followed the usual practice of any established artist at the time and did have some of the painting done by pupils and assistants in his workshop.
The city of Siena was delighted with the result. The majestic altarpiece, its painted prayer to the Madonna, was the focus of worship here for nearly 200 years.
The architecture and layout of the city centre of Siena haven't changed that much over the last 600 years. They can tell us quite a bit about Tuscan society in the 13th century, especially about the increasing power of secular groups like wealthy merchants.
This is the Campo, the city square that Duccio's Maestà was paraded around before being taken to the cathedral. It's one of the striking things about this city that it's not just all centred on the cathedral. In fact, all roads seem to lead to the Campo. This whole area was laid out and planned at the end of the 13th century. And it's interesting because you see both things happening. There's both a focus on the church, this is when the Duomo is being expanded and remodelled, but also a focus on building grand civic spaces like this. This square is dominated by the building behind me, the Palazzo Pubblico. It's a huge civic palace. It actually still houses the city's municipal offices today. The design of the square actually reflects both civic and religious ideas. The decorative brickwork divides it up into 9 separate sections. This both reflects the Council of Nine, the quasi-democratic group that actually ruled Siena at this time, and it
This is a private devotional painting from the early 14th century. It was made by Duccio in about 1315, and it still has the shutters which can be closed to protect the images of the most important figures inside. The left shutter shows St. Dominic, so whoever paid for this was probably a Dominican. On the right shutter we see St. Aurea, who was drowned at the Roman port of Ostia with a millstone around her neck. The presence of both of these saints suggests that the patron who ordered this work might have been Niccolò da Prato, the Dominican Cardinal Bishop of Ostia. What's really fantastic about this object, though, is the central panel, the way that the Virgin and Child have been shown. There seems to be a really intimate relationship between the two of them. They look into each other's eyes, and the Christ child plays with his mother's veil. Of course, it's still not totally realistic. Christ is like a miniature toddler, balancing effortlessly on Mary's arm, held in place by her unfeasibly long fingers. But let's just compare it to the Virgin and Child from Margherita of Arezzo's altarpiece. These two works are only 50 years apart, but the figures really do look different in the work by Duccio, much more naturalistic. One rather unrealistic element that wouldn't have been visible in this work when it was first made is the greenish tinge to the skin. Duccio used this green underpaint as an early layer in the painting process, marking out areas of light and shade so that the flesh would look more rounded. Thin layers of flesh-coloured paint were applied over the top, but these have become transparent so the green now shows through. The Virgin Mary may have looked more like this when she was first painted. Brushstrokes. If you look closely at the surface of early Italian Renaissance paintings, you can see these.
These panels were painted by the Sienese artist Ugolino Danerio, who was one of Duccio's most gifted followers. He was just one of many artists in the 14th century who continued to develop more naturalistic ways of painting. Again, we see particularly action-packed, dramatic scenes in the predella panels, such as the betrayal of Christ and the way to Calvary.
Throughout this part of the National Gallery, you can see paintings that bring out the drama and emotion in religious scenes, and which try hard to represent them as taking place in believable, three-dimensional spaces. This panel showing the Crucifixion is by Jacopo di Cione, painted in about 1368. you can really get involved in what's going on. The grief on the women's faces is particularly affecting. Pietro Lorenzetti has created a really complex space in this painting of St. Sabinus before the governor Venustianus, refusing to worship a pagan idol and thereby moving a step closer to becoming a Christian martyr. Lorenzetti has set himself the very difficult task of showing a vaulted roof receding into the distance. And he's nearly got it right, but not quite. In 1342, when this painting was made, Italian artists didn't yet have the technology to create the perfect illusion of three-dimensional space in a flat panel painting. So, what had changed by the beginning of the next century, when Masaccio painted the Virgin and Child that we started with? This was made in 1426, and it's clear that Masaccio knew how to draw the lines of the Virgin's throne precisely so that it appears to go back into space. He's painted the two musician angels in the foreground as if they're really sitting on the steps up to the throne. Their lutes are foreshortened, so we see only what you actually do see when you see a lute from the side. The long neck of the instrument is hardly visible at all. That's what gives the illusion of three-dimensional space. That and the lighting, which creates shadows that makes the flesh look more rounded.
Masaccio was putting into practice ideas developed by the architect and sculptor Brunelleschi. He was famous for having designed and built the dome that covers the cathedral here in Florence, the Duomo. This was something that was regarded as a real feat of engineering. The space that had to be covered by the dome was absolutely enormous. You can see the building is huge. Nobody knew quite how it was going to be done. There was a big competition and lots of suggestions. There was one marvellous suggestion that if you built a huge mound of earth, you could then construct the dome on top of it. That would support the dome while it was being built. And then you get rid of the earth. If you'd first studded it with coins, then you would just invite the Florentines in to pick out the coins and they'd remove all the earth for you. Bit of a slur, but something that tells you just how the Florentines were seen as rather money-oriented at this time. Anyway, Brunelleschi did manage to come up with a system for building this extraordinary dome. So we perhaps shouldn't be surprised that he's also someone who works out a way of representing three-dimensional space on a flat surface.
It works on the basis of the observation that parallel lines will appear to get closer together the further away they are from the viewer. Eventually they converge, they meet and disappear from view on the horizon. It's an optical illusion. For example, a real fence stretching into the distance remains parallel to the ground. But to the viewer, it looks as if it's met the pavement and disappeared. In a painting, that's what creates the illusion of depth, of space that doesn't just go up and down and across a scene, but also seems to go back into it. Brunelleschi's system used this observation of converging lines leading to a vanishing point, or even two vanishing points if you want to make the angle more interesting. As long as the object you're drawing conforms to these converging lines, you'll get the effect of perspective. It works for curved shapes as well as straight edges. They're a bit more tricky, but it's possible.
This was the illusion that artists had been trying to achieve, and now a precise method had been established. Brunelleschi's ideas were quickly spread around Italy, particularly after they were described by a writer named Alberti, who wrote an influential treatise on painting in the early 15th century. By the 1450s, artists were really starting to get to grips with the concept.
This is Paulo Uccello's depiction of the Battle of San Romano, a conflict that took place in 1432, during which the Florentines defeated their long-term rivals, the Sienese. We think that Uccello made this version a few years later, perhaps around 1438 or 1440. He's made what was actually quite a minor skirmish into a heroic victory, showing the Florentine leader Niccolo da Tolentino as a fine military commander on his white horse. The battle scene at the front of the picture is complicated as the two armies engage in a tangle of limbs and weapons. But look how carefully Uccello has placed the broken lances on the floor so that they all point towards one vanishing point, hidden somewhere behind the hedge. Even a fallen knight in armour has been pressed into service, his body emphasising the perspective lines. Uccello's done the same thing in this painting of St. George and the Dragon. The grass outside the dragon's lair is growing in carefully manicured squares of lawn so that we get those receding lines. He's also tried to show St. George's horse in perspective, which is perhaps why he seems a bit angular. It's all been worked out with a ruler.
Uccello was reportedly obsessed with perspective. Vasari wrote of how his wife used to sit in bed calling to her husband while he laboured over his drawing board into the early hours, sighing to himself, "Ah, what a sweet mistress this perspective is." It's probably a story we should take with a pinch of salt, but it does remind us how Uccello had a reputation as a real pioneer of perspective.
Other artists developed the technique with a bit more subtlety. This is Piero della Francesca's very carefully composed representation of the baptism of Christ, painted in the 1450s for a chapel in his hometown of Borgo San Sepolcro in Tuscany. The effect of depth in the painting has been achieved by having lines winding back through the recognisably Tuscan landscape and by placing people and trees at strategic points. Each one gets smaller as we look further into the painting. If you sketched in lines that followed the tops and bottoms of the trees, for example, you'd see that they matched invisible guidelines that meet at a vanishing point just to the right of the picture, halfway up the panel. So, when Masaccio painted his Madonna and Child back in 1426, he was skillfully using a very new technique for depicting three-dimensional space. He was also, though, being inspired by other art forms too. We can see evidence of Masaccio studying ancient monuments. Look at the architectural features on the throne. He studied sculpture too, both classical and contemporary, and looked at the ways that light fell on it. This was central to the development of strategies for painting bodies that looked solid, made from apparently rounded forms. This is the church of Or San Michele in Florence. As you can see, it's covered with sculpture. When the building was converted from being a trade hall and grain store into a church in the late 14th century, it was decided that each of the powerful trade guilds should commission a sculpture for one of the niches on the outside. Most were made in the early 15th century, the time when Masaccio was painting, and an exciting time in Florentine sculpture. This church must have been like an outdoor gallery of cutting-edge, realistic sculpture. This figure of St. Mark was made by Donatello, one of the leading sculptors of the day. He really developed the art of monumental, freestanding sculptures. His figures are rounded, and they often have a lifelike, dramatic quality about them. Painters learned a lot from looking at what sculptors like Donatello were doing. There were many exchanges of ideas between the two art forms at this point. Some artists worked in both media. Others made the most of close connections to sculptors. We know, for example, that Masaccio was friends with Donatello, such a trusted friend, in fact, that Masaccio allowed him to collect payments on his behalf for the altarpiece, whose central panel is now in the National Gallery.
So, all sorts of factors contribute to the way that art changes at this time. A new focus on both the ideas and artefacts of antiquity sparks off debate and suggests a new way for perhaps looking at the world. We've got cities like Florence and Siena that are becoming wealthy and expanding. There are then wealthy merchants who increasingly decide to commission awe-inspiring art as a way of both showing their devotion and also displaying off their status. New orders of monks promote religious teaching that's perhaps best served by a kind of art that tells stories and which shows human emotion in visually compelling ways. Artists working in all sorts of media develop techniques that enable them to create realistic, believable representations of the world and to suggest that objects are really there in three-dimensional space. So, we do see a real move towards naturalism. And that's certainly a story we can tell, how that develops. But it's not the only story. By no means all patrons and artists wanted to paint completely realistic looking art, even once they'd seen the latest techniques in action.
One of the things you really notice in the National Gallery is that even though the early Italian art is arranged roughly chronologically, you don't actually just see paintings becoming progressively more and more realistic. Florentine painting is where some of the big advances in this field were made. But it's clear from the pictures made there during the second half of the 14th century and in the early 15th century that many painters there didn't have total naturalism as their aim at all. You can see that glorious, intricate patterning is also very high on the agenda. This huge painting of Jesus crowning his mother in heaven was made, we think, by Jacopo di Cione and his workshop. It stood in the church of San Pier Maggiore in Florence. The church was destroyed in the 18th century, but you can get an idea of what it looked like from the model of it that St. Peter, San Pier, is holding. There are some limited moves to represent depth and space here, but by far the most striking feature of this painting is the delicate patterning on so many surfaces. Gold embroidery has been represented by the artist painting over the top of a gilded area and then scratching away the painted layer to reveal the gold underneath. This technique, called sgraffito, which means scratched in Italian, made it possible to decorate panels with incredibly detailed gold patterns. The elegant, ornate throne and dozens of punched gold halos stacked up either side add to the splendour of this work. We can see similar interests in lots of other paintings from the late 14th and early 15th centuries. This is another representation of the coronation of the Virgin, this time by an artist monk known as Lorenzo Monaco. It was made for a monastery, as both an aid to contemplation and prayer, and also as a sort of corporate identity statement about this particular order of monks. They were Camaldolese, a reformed Benedictine order who wore white habits. Their founder, St. Romuald, is shown on the front row of saints with the big names like St. Peter, who holds the key to heaven, and of course a sternly approving St. Benedict on the other side. Again, though, it's clear that having dazzling colours and saints arranged in a repeat pattern is just as important as some of the more realistic touches here, perhaps even more so. We can imagine how the robes and wings of the angels must have shimmered in the light of the candles on the altar beneath. These beautiful wings belong to the angels who crowd onto one panel of the Wilton diptych, a small portable altarpiece that we think was made in about 1395 for the English King Richard II. He's shown kneeling in worship on the other side. This isn't technically an Italian work. We don't know who made it, in fact, although it might have been an artist who trained in Italy, since some of the techniques are really similar to those of Sienese artists. It shows, though, that in many cases naturalism doesn't just take over. Here we've got some very realistic details, like the body of St. John the Baptist. However, they're set within an overall design that really puts fantastic decorative detail first.
Gentile da Fabriano painted this Virgin and Child on loan to the National Gallery from the Royal Collection in 1425, the same time that Masaccio was working on his Virgin and Child. It's very different. Instead of Masaccio's solid sculptural forms and precise depiction of three-dimensional space, Gentile has painted a delicate, decorative panel.
His Christ child smiles sweetly, holding a daisy that's symbolic of his innocence. It's a kind of painting that had a significant market. Gentile enjoyed considerable success travelling around Italy and working for the most distinguished patrons.
So, while some artists were definitely interested in naturalism, we shouldn't assume that all painters were striving towards a perfectly realistic way of representing the world. The paintings we've been looking at, like the cities they were produced in, were about honour and glory. Naturalistic painting techniques can certainly serve that purpose, but so can things like intense colour and patterning and gold. So when we look at the work of artists like Margherito and Masaccio, yes, there's certainly lots of differences between them, but in some senses there's lots of continuity too.